Amen. As I stand before you this morning, I want to greet you in the name of my Savior, Jesus Christ, the Spirit and the person who died to save all of us. I want to thank Sister Rhonda and the lay council for inviting me to be with you this morning. Just to share a few words and a few thoughts about where we are in terms of our faith, in terms of our being, and in terms of where we are in terms of civil rights in this country. Before I do that, 4 years ago this week, I began a journey that changed my life. On September 30th, 2015, I received a diagnosis from my internist that I had multiple myeloma. When you boil it down, simply it's cancer. And that's a frightening thought. I held a pity party for about 30 seconds and said, God be with me. I have not looked back since. And when we began our journey through life, we think of one thing: God be with me as I venture through. The lay council gave me a topic this morning, and I looked at that topic and I said, my God, my God. The topic was refocusing on our people, reviewing our practices, retooling our people, reaching our potential. When I look at that, I boil it down to one thing. And as many of you who are my age, and I just celebrated 72 years this past Tuesday, I recall the words of the congressman from New York who served at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the Reverend Dr. Adam Clayton Powell, when he said, keep the faith, baby. And when I look at the topic, that's what I think about, keeping the faith. When you read the scripture that was presented to us this morning, and when you put on the whole armor, when you put that armor on, you're thinking about keeping the faith. We as Christians, and when we began our journey, we think about keeping the faith, moving towards the goal. The goal is to serve, not only to serve our God, but to serve mankind and personkind also. When we began our journey, we have no concept or no idea of what we are getting into. But as we fall on our knees, we began to pray, and we ask for strength. This past August, we as African Americans, Black Americans, commemorated 400 years of being in this country. 400 years of being viewed upon, spat upon, beat upon, vilified. And in 400 years, we've made substantial progress. But when we began to look at where we are, we still have a long ways to go. 400 years. And when we look back over those 400 years, right around 1619 and a little bit afterwards, the good white folk in this country and in Europe, taking a word from how to treat folk, wrote a special Bible called the Slave Bible. I don't know whether you've heard of that, but it was a book that was written to keep slaves in their place. The book was only about, I think, less than 100 chapters. And when we began to look at the Bible as a whole, there are numerous chapters in there. But the good white folk of this country decided, well, we can't tell the story of the good news. We have to keep these folk and their minds captured. So therefore, we will omit how the Jews overcame. We will omit the good news of the Bible. We want these folk to understand that they have to worship their master here on earth. Do as the master says. But you know, as we look back upon that, what kept us all those years? Our faith. You know, we came out of that initial 1619. Then we moved into an era a few hundred years later dealing with the Civil War. But prior to that, we had brave persons like Harriet Tubman, who refused to bow down, who took the rifle in her hand and said, we have to free our brothers and sisters, and began a massive move to do that. That inspired quite a few folk to begin to move. We look at Frederick Douglass of our time, of the time, how he began to move to deal with the whole attitude of slavery, how the Civil War was fought. And we are misguided sometimes by the Civil War, whether or not it was fought to free the slaves or whether or not it was an economic war. We have learned the truth, that it was not to free the slaves, but an economic war. But as we began to move through that process, we kept the faith. The faith kept us moving through that. Well, we had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Because you see, when those good folk met to write the Constitution, they did not think about us. They thought about us as what? 3/5 of a person. Well, how can you get 3/5 of a person? That was because something was moving against us, but we kept the faith during that period of time. When we came out of that, we got the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which allowed black folk, allowed slaves to be free, which allowed us and gave us the right to vote. It also gave us the right to be able to enter into contracts. However, our faith was tested again. Looked like every move we made during that period of time, there was a counter move by folk that did not look like us. There arose after that an era called Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a mythical figure who wanted to oversee and keep the enslaved blacks enslaved. They began to develop a series of laws and policies that would oversee our period. There began a time when we could not, as you well know, utilize a water fountain that said white. There was a colored water fountain. There was a time that we could not go into court and swear on the same Bible as white folk. In the great state of Oklahoma, the good white folk even went to the extreme of keeping our textbooks separated from black textbooks. The white textbooks were segregated in a different place than black textbooks. And when you went to the courthouse in the state of Missouri, you could not use the same Coke machine as white folk. These were called the Jim Crow laws. These were the things that kept us enslaved in our mentality. But through this, we kept our faith. Our faith has kept us going on and on. And look like every time that we make one good step forward, we have to take two back. So after we defeated Jim Crow, there ushered in a time, a real time called segregation in America, where our kids could not go to the same school as white folk. I grew up in the great state of North Carolina, where my elementary school was 4 rooms, an outhouse for a bathroom, a spigot, as we call a water fountain, on the outside, while around the corner was this white school built with bricks, with a cafeteria, indoor plumbing. And if you've grown up and you know North Carolina, indoor plumbing was a luxury. So you look at the segregated schools. I came out of a high school called Ralph J. Bunch High School. And across the way was the white high school that had a chemistry lab, where only in my school we had a single Bunsen burner. We did not have the equipment. We shared textbooks. We did not have all the equipment that was given to the white school. This was to keep black folk entrapped, and so that you could not make progress. But in spite of that, we began to look back at those years and how, by keeping the faith, we developed, as a people, a strong character. We began to overcome those inequities. And when we got ready to go to college, there was the University of North Carolina, Duke University, all of those schools. We couldn't go. Could not go. If anything, they would allow 1 black per year to enter. So the next best thing was to go to a historically black institution. And to this day, I am so proud of being a product of a historically black institution. Just like your pastor, the proud alumni of Livingston, which was down the street from A&T. We are a product of hard times. But through these times, we did what? We kept the faith. Because faith kept us going. This was something that was instilled to us and in us by our parents and by our extended family. So once we got to that hurdle, then what's next in life? What's next? We began to enter our professional times. When I came out of A&T to go to law school at the University of Kansas, there were 4 of us that were allowed to attend. I wanted to go to the University of North Carolina. But again, that quota system, 1 per year. But thank God there were still avenues available, because we that came out of those historically black institutions, we kept the faith. We were strong. So therefore, we would not be deterred on where we were going. So when we began to walk through our life and to enter our professions, we kept that faith. Even to now, when we look at black folk as a whole, and as we came out of that system of Jim Crowism, we came out into a system of pure segregation. Kids were not allowed to go to school. Our jobs were always in jeopardy when we could get those good jobs. When we began to look in terms of what's happening in this country in terms of civil rights. In 1964, Congress prevailed and passed the first major Civil Rights Act in 1964. Although we had had semblance of a Civil Rights Act in 1957, and when we came out of World War II, there was some semblance of civil rights. But the real action began in 1964. And in 1965, there was another major step forward. Through all of this, we were still not allowed to cast our votes in a system that was fair. We were beaten at times when we would try to go to the polls, when we tried to register, and when we tried to vote. The first step was to register. And some of you can recall, if you were not a part of it, your parents or grandparents telling you what they had to go through to simply to get their names on the register to vote. They were asked questions that white folk couldn't answer. They were asked to interpret the Constitution. But most of those registers, white folk couldn't even spell Constitution. So how could they, in turn, tell you that you were not ready to be a voter? These are the things that we came through. So through our faith, we were able to get the 1964 Civil Rights Act passed, the 1965 voting rights, which is under attack today. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. had to die before we got the Fair Housing Bill passed. 1 week prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act dealing with fair housing, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Within 7 days, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which had been before Congress for 10 years. So, in order for us to get fair housing, our martyr had to die, Martin Luther King. So after that, we began to move in various areas to where we had to secure our civil rights through constant marching. When you look at our leadership in Congress now, and we look back at John Lewis, what he had to suffer crossing the Edwin Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. His head was bashed in. But through it all, what happened? He kept the faith. He kept the faith. And as we began to move through the various avenues in this country today, we still have to do that. We have come a long ways in those 400 years, but we still have a long ways to go. When Congress now is trying to take away what we got through the Voting Rights Act, they are trying to create different ways of not allowing us to vote. A case in point, at my undergrad school, North Carolina A.M.E. State University, there are 2 congressional districts running through that campus. Why? To dilute the vote of those black students. They are now divided between 2 congressional districts. No way in the world should that occur. But because of the trickery that we have to deal with, that's what's going on. But through it all, those students are keeping the faith and are in court now, battling that. So hopefully by 2020, there will be only 1 congressional district on the campus. We have to deal with the dilution of our vote. So therefore, we have to as a people, keep the faith. When we look at what's going on at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, this is the time that will test our faith. When we look at the untruths being spewed from a mouth of a person that I consider less than a human. When you look at the conditions that are being employed among immigrants, when we look at all the trickery that's going on, we as a people have to keep our faith. This is where we have to bow down and pray continuously and ask, one, for forgiveness, because we have some thoughts coming about this person up there at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but to maintain our faith. This is where we are. When we look back at the 400 years that we have traveled in this country, we think in terms of, my God, we are still here. We ain't going nowhere. This is our home. We have suffered. We have toiled. We have shed blood. And because of that, we will maintain this is our home and we will stay. So these are the things that we have overcome in those 400 years. So we maintain our faith. So we look at our churches. You know, we can recall, and I can recall at Ward Chapel, years ago, we had 400 to 500 members every Sunday. When we look at our connectional, we had many more churches. When we began to put together and going to our general conference in 2020, we're going with fewer and fewer members than 4 years ago. And I would imagine the same thing is happening with the A.M.E. Zion. I'm sure when you look around, the church was populated more a few years ago than where we are now. And when you go to your general conference in 2020, there will be fewer and fewer going. So what do we have to do? What do we have to do as laypersons? We have to maintain our faith that things are going to get better. How do we do that? We have to be a witness to say the goodness of God, the goodness of the Lord has helped us through this time. This is just an adjustment we're going through. This is just a period of being tested in our churches. So how do we get these pews back? How do we fill this congregation? How do we do that in the A.M.E. Church? How do we do that in the A.M.E. Zion Church? When we look at the success of so-called mega churches of 10,000, 20,000, and what do they do? What's the difference there? Sometimes we as a people, we are looking for instant gratification. We want to be able to go to worship and get in and get out and not be bothered or be talked to by the minister. We just go in and get out. That is not the way we were brought up. That is not our way. We have anointed our leaders to be leaders, to be able to touch the congregation, to be able to touch and talk to the members. And we don't want this speed through or drive through religion that some are using now. And I look at some of these mega churches. You can go in and slip in if you want to and not be noticed. You don't even know the name of the person you're sitting beside. Is that what we are all about? No, we are not. This is why it's so important for the lay council and the lay organization, the lay council of the A.M.E. Zion and the lay organization of the A.M.E. Church, is to be active, be proactive, to keep and show that we are faithful, to show that we have overcome. So this is where we are today in terms of the lay organization and the lay council. I often said that, particularly for our bishops in the A.M.E. church, we look around, we are bishop-led, but lay-fed. Now, last Sunday, I proclaimed that if the lay were to walk out and boycott, and this was a mighty message, and move to one side of the church or in the fellowship hall, what would that leave at Ward Chapel? It would leave the Reverend Virgil Gordon Glenn in the pulpit by himself. This is why we as lay folk, you are a sleeping giant. You are a sleeping giant. And when you go to your general conference in 2020, as the same as I'm going to our general conference in 2020, we are going with a message. We have kept the faith, but it's time now to listen, and to listen to where we are more so. We understand that we are led by bishops, but without our money, where would you be? So this is a time for lay persons to come together. This is the time for you to begin to speak, because you have maintained the faith through all these years. And now it's time for you to speak. There are times now when you began to look at your legislation. How do you want to see changes made in your church? You have the power to do that. You have the audacity to make changes. So as you began to journey in 2020, look back and see the history of the lay council and how it evolved over time to where you are now. The same thing that we will do as a lay organization in the A.M.E. church. You are powerful. You maintain that power because you have kept the faith. So we look at the dichotomy that I talked about this morning, where we are as a people in the United States, how we have maintained our faith to keep going on, and how we as a people in our various denominations have kept the faith. This is where we want to be. And as I started out with Adam Clayton Powell, it is up to us to keep the faith. Let's move on upward, and as we climb, let's remember to lift as we climb. Keep the faith.